Hello and welcome to this video interview with Singh Verick. Sher is a ILO Decent Work Team for South Asia Deputy Director, and he has just edited this volume of research along with Sukti Dasgupta from ILO. The report is titled Transformation of Women at Work in Asia. So this volume doesn't just examine women's engagement with the labor market, but also goes into examine social transformation and other such factors which have affected women's participation in the labor market. This also basically answers two questions. One is, how have women contributed in the economic transformation in Asia, and how have they benefited from this transformation in the region? So Sher, before we go into finer details, I'd like you to give us a brief overview of why this work is important and what are the interesting observations that have come out in this report that you would like to highlight.
Yeah, sure. So going back over the last 5 years, data that came out of India told us a rather surprising and puzzling trend, namely that women's participation in the labour force declined during the 2000s. And this was a period, of course, when economic growth was averaging around 8% per annum.
Yeah.
So this came as a real surprise to policymakers and academics alike. This led to a lot of research, including by the ILO, which we've used for this book, to look at why this was the case. And there are a number of key factors there, which the book highlights in terms of women withdrawing from the labour force because of education, because of rising incomes in rural households and women shifting to domestic duties. But most importantly, our key message is that there were lack of other job opportunities for women in those rural areas where most of that decline took place. Now, what is very important and what this book does is tells us, where does India fit in with the rest of Asia?
Yeah.
India is not unique. Most of South Asia has very low labour force participation rates for women. Nepal is an exception, but really you see it across the South Asia region, along with the Middle East and North Africa. So India is not unique in the low level. What was the puzzling part was that decline. And now when you look at the rest of Asia, a critical factor that we highlight in this book is that, where economies have been able to grow fast and also experience a rapid process of economic and social transformation, were economies where women have really been a central part of that through the labour market. So this book really gives us a very strong comparative insight on the situation in India, going well beyond what we see just within this country. And a really important message is in the book that, if an economy is to maintain high rates of economic growth that is inclusive, women really have to be at the centre of this. And this really remains an unfinished development agenda in many countries in the region. And this is why this book is putting India in such a context.
So according to the National Sample Survey, the drop in female labour participation was around 10.1% from 2005 to 2010, which was more significant in the rural areas than in the urban areas, say around more than twice in fact. So do you think it is just because of the migration of female labour to urban centres in search of better job opportunities, more quality job opportunities, or are there more factors in play here?
Yes, you're correct to put the focus on the rural labour market, because really the vast majority of women who withdrew were in rural areas, and this continued to 2011-12 if you look at the NSS data. Now, it's difficult to have a good understanding of what happened with migration, but we know migration wasn't the major factor. But it's hard to get very clear numbers on that. But really what has happened is women have withdrawn from agriculture in rural areas. They've withdrawn from agriculture, now are coming up in NSS as being engaged in domestic duties. Now, as we discussed in the book and has been looked at more broadly in this research area, is that there's no clear distinction between working on your farm versus being in domestic duties. There's a lot of overlap, and this is a measurement issue, and measurement is a dimension that we highlight. And there's a lot of debate around that. Well, women are still working, of course. They are working, even if they're classified as domestic duties, they are still doing contributing a lot to the household economy and care economy, of course.
Yeah.
But rather than going into that debate, which is an important one, this book says, well, look, that may be the case, but women who have withdrawn in rural labour markets in India and aren't going into jobs outside the home, either in terms of factory work or office work, service sector, etc. So they're not hiding there, they're hiding in the household. That has its own legitimate part to it, and that's not a criticism of that process. But what we know for sure is that women aren't hiding, those numbers aren't hidden in the labour market outside the home. So this is the fundamental issue about the rural labour market. So the real test is, and for the coming years, is how jobs can be created in rural areas, or areas where women who are living in rural areas can access. We see that, of course, happening more and more in the south of India. This is growing, and so one should recognise that diversity within India. India is not one country; it is a continent, and it has very diverse labour markets. So you do see that growth of jobs in the south, but it's really the north where a lot of challenges remain.
So how does this fit into the U-shaped hypothesis that you have described in this book? Can you elaborate what exactly do you mean by it?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it's, if you look at this whole discourse, not only in India but globally, it goes back a number of decades. There has been this stylized U-shaped hypothesis, which basically said, look, when countries are poor, low-income countries, everyone is working, women and men, because they have to, out of necessity. Now, as countries develop, participation falls as women withdraw, and
but
then
they don't get opportunities in other sectors.
Right. Yes, but there's also a part of the social norms are still there, right? So women are withdrawing, and as economies then develop in terms of the structural transformation part, they're going from agriculture when it's poor to rise in manufacturing, and then the service sector. And traditionally, of course, the service sector has been the entry point for women. Service sector either in the private sector, but also of course through education, health, etc. Now, this is a stylized hypothesis which you see in the data. If you take cross-sectional data, you'll see it, but it's misleading, because it's this idea that it will follow sort of a deterministic process in our country, that women withdraw and it's going to increase once the country becomes more well-off, is distorted by what we see in Scandinavia, Australia, etc., because they're the ones where it's high. And if you look in Asia, you see a very different story. There is no U-shape in Asia. If you take the Asian countries together, there is just no U-shape. What you have is poor, low-income countries with high levels of participation, like Cambodia, Nepal, Bangladesh is more with the South Asia. So you've got the South Asian countries where participation is lower. Bangladesh has traditionally been a country with a low level of participation, but Bangladesh is interesting because participation is increased the fastest during the 2000s. And this is very much then linked to the story about garments, this whole structural transformation process. Garments, but also agriculture through microcredit has been an important way for women to get involved into poultry, farming, livestock, etc. So the thing is, the U-shape is misleading because it gives us some sort of false assumption that, don't worry, women withdraw and then return. If you look at Asia, even in the richest countries, participation rates of women are still considerably lower than men. A gender gap remains even in the richest countries. If you would take, Japan, Korea, Singapore, participation rates of women remain low, relatively low. So this is something we cannot just say, well, it's going to happen by itself. We follow a U-shape. It's something that a gender gap and linked to social norms continues to be a really important factor. So one has to really look at it directly and target it directly.
When we look at the global trends in participation of women in the labor force, how stark is the contrast when we look specifically at India, not just the entire Asia?
Yeah, that's right. So, India has a low level, but it has actually declined, and this has dragged down the whole South Asia average. If you look at the ILO figures for an regional level, South Asia is actually one of the only regions where participation of women is falling. You have Middle East and North Africa, which traditionally has much lower rates, even than South Asia, but there is actually increasing slowly, but it's increasing.
Why do you think that is? Are there some strong sectors which absorb more female labor within them, like the garment industry in Bangladesh?
Well, in Middle East and North Africa, part of that is a service sector jobs that are being created, education and health sector where women are entering. It's in more of those formal sector jobs. So you do need manufacturing exists in some of these countries, but it's not playing the same role as it is in Bangladesh. But you see, a big increase. The biggest increase has been in Latin America. And Latin America, you've had both the economic transformation process going on. So jobs are being created, in fact, it's not really driven by manufacturing as such, but the service sector. But women's education has increased considerably over a long period, which has given women then the ability to join the labour force in the service sector, in a more formal part of the service sector. So, South Asia does stand out as being the only region where the labour force participation rates is really now had come down during the 2000s, and that is driven in particular by the case of India.
You've also mentioned here that about occupational segregation, like men benefit disproportionately from the demand of skilled labor in the Indian workforce. And so what do you think are the steps that we need to take so that women can also be equipped and there is more demand for women also in the highly skilled labor workforce?
That's right. It's a very important aspect to look at because though there's been this sort of discussion around jobless growth, etc., in the Indian context, all this data tells us is actually men were benefiting very much from job growth. Men have been able to work in sectors which have been rapidly growing. And women have been, when women have worked, they've been in sectors that are not growing as fast or in fact declining, like agriculture. Now there are pros and cons in looking at these sectors. Construction sector was the fastest growing sector in terms of job creation. It created many jobs for men, some women, but mostly for men. But there, of course, decent work deficits are a challenge. So one, can unpack that. But really, the fundamental issue of occupational segregation tells us that, more efforts are needed, and a lot is going on in India. So one should recognise that a lot, but more efforts are going to be needed in terms of women getting educated. Even before we start talking about the skilling, right? What we find in India, but we find in Sri Lanka, we find in many countries is education only pays when you have at least 10 or 12 years of schooling. Unfortunately, in the labour market today, even if you're in rural India or you're in any other country, 8 years of school doesn't make any difference. It just doesn't give you a leg up in the labour market.
More focus on tertiary education.
Exactly. So the first step will be to get young girls into upper secondary school, and so you had a big and a very impressive improvement, of course, in primary education in India. Mm-hmm. Now, lower secondary. Now, upper secondary is key. You need at least the 10, 12 years of schooling, and then ideally the tertiary qualifications have to kick in. Now, there you want to distinguish between, university type education, the formal education versus vocational education and training. So, of course, it's a big priority now in India, and it's a very important priority, is to access vocational education and training as well. So, this is critical steps to have in place before women will be in a position to take advantage of the new jobs that are being created. Because look, frankly, as technology is developing, the world is more integrated. India is a highly integrated economy now. The jobs that are going to be created require skills. And you're going to need a good level of education and some skilling on top of that gives you that edge in the labour market. So it is absolutely fundamental that we see that achieved for young girls and for young women who are able then to get into the labour market. But there are other factors that one has to look at as well in terms of the constraints for women to participate, right? I mean, social norms remain an issue, so it's very important to continue to work on the awareness around social norms to improve the actual access to jobs, given that social norms are still there. And one also cannot just wish them away or should. I mean, social norms are part of the fabric of a society, and they should develop in the right process, in the right way. But in India, it'll be important that more jobs are created in locations that women can access. Not all, and you mentioned migration, because not all women can or should migrate. Yeah. Migration creates its own vulnerabilities. It creates opportunities.
Local job creation also is very crucial.
Exactly. So local job creation, I mean, it's an important message of the book is very important, because you're going to need more jobs created in places where women live, and the bulk of the population still in rural areas. India is still 65% of the population is in rural areas. Urbanization is increasing, but will continue at a rather at a slowish pace. I mean, women will need jobs in those rural areas.
Yeah. Also, when we talk about job creation, this also we must also focus on the quality of jobs that are created. So when we discuss, you have also given some suggestions on policy implementation that could increase labor participation for women in India. So do you think a push towards more formal jobs rather than contractual or informal labor should be a key a point here?
It is a very important dimension. quantity of jobs is one part of the story. We need jobs to be created, and that's and people focus on this aspect a lot around the world. Job creation, but actually it's very critical to look at the quality of employment, as you pointed out, in terms of the decent work dimensions. Now, there are a number of angles to that. A very important part is what I mentioned on education and skill development, because a critical issue in terms of the quality of jobs is what you can earn, the wages. If you're able to get a reasonable wage, this will act as a pull factor to bring you into the labour market. If wages remain very low for you, then your incentive as a woman becomes lower. And then if you are also juggling the responsibilities of looking after a family and all that, and that time burden that exists there, it becomes very difficult. So quality of employment is typically linked to your education and skills development as a first step. But that's of course not enough. Beyond that, we need to look at the rights that women have in the workplace and their protection. Rights, linked to many dimensions. Prevention of sexual harassment is critical, and there's a Sexual Harassment Act that is there. Promotion of that and the implementation of that is very important. The right for women to organise and be represented. Minimum wages are important, linked to the wage issue. Access to social protection and social security is a critical dimension, because what we know is as well from other countries is that if women are to join, and we want women to join, or have the choice to join, it's important to say the choice to join the workforce, they need better quality jobs. This is, will be an important pull factor to bring women in. So it is very important that when we look at the policy response, it's not only about creating jobs, it's about creating good jobs which provide access to social protection, which provide opportunities in terms of maternity benefit and rights around that, ideally, and we look. Of course, you have some good cases now in India at the top end is issues around childcare, etc. But there, the form. So the bottom line is, the formalization of employment will go a long way to getting women into the labour force, because it'll make it that much easier for them, and it'll be a stronger incentive for them to join. So if an employer is able to offer a regular job with employment benefits, paid leave, maternity leave, access to social security, of course it's going to act as a very powerful pull factor, which has got very important macroeconomic implications for the country.
Yeah. Also, you've mentioned the freedom for women to organize.
Yeah.
To negotiate with the employers for better wages, better social security benefits. So constitutionally, we have been guaranteed a right to organize in India, but as well as I do, that's not really that's not really happening on ground, because we have seen a lot of movements, trade union movement being crushed throughout India. So do you think also it is also very crucial for men as well, irrespective of gender? The workers should have a freedom to organize, to negotiate, form unions. So in your research, have you also studied the women organizing themselves in unions across India?
Well, this is not a key focus of this book, because frankly, there are many issues that are linked to this whole topic of women in the labour force. But I would stress that it is a critical factor that for the ILO anywhere in the world to see that all workers, and women of course in particular, have the right to organise and freedom of association, the right to bargain collectively. And I'm saying this not only because of the fundamental rights that attach to that is important, but there's a very good economic argument as well. If you want a productive workforce, you need to engage with your workers. Contract labour and who have no commitment to the workforce, to the employer, and similarly an employer who has no commitment to his workers, is just a suboptimal outcome for both the business and for society. So I think one has to be very clear on that it's an economic argument as well. It's a rights argument, and it's a very important one, but there's also a very fundamental economic argument. Now we are all aware of the challenges that exist for organisation around the world. It's a global phenomenon, and it is very important that we look at how to strengthen trade unions and other stakeholders in order for constructive social dialogue to take place. And it's critical that it's seen in a constructive economic context. Social dialogue should take place to promote good economic outcomes for employers and workers. And there is a win-win that can be achieved if it's done properly. And that is, that should be the goal of all these processes.
Okay, one last question. Can you also elaborate the policy measures that you have recommended for increasing female participation in the Indian workforce?
Right, so in terms of increasing the participation, there is no single solution. One has to look at a comprehensive, integrated approach. Now, there are 6 key pillars that the book highlights. One is really the issue around job creation and access to jobs. Jobs need to be promoted in terms of through investment in specific sectors, but this will need to be looked at through this lens to ensure that women are able to access them. So this is going to be about jobs being created in some of the poorer states in India, in more rural areas where women will be able to access. But clearly, just the job creation will not be enough. You need to look at the education and skills development to ensure that women can access the good jobs, the decent work that's being created. Now, when we look at the supply side constraints for women in terms of their own burdens, a number of areas need to be looked at. The time burden. So really a big constraint for women is the fact that they're traditionally looking after the family, the children, the elderly, and other domestic duties, which makes it very difficult for them to leave the household. So there it's very important when we look at childcare, access to decent childcare. We look at technology being a key way to reduce the burden in terms of being able to reduce the amount of domestic duties. Access to fresh and clean water globally, we know, has been a very important step for women to be able to work, because it reduces that burden by hours per day. Similarly for electricity, and these things are already happening in a big way, but that has to be part of it. A third thing linked to this issue of infrastructure is the overall access for women to transport. If you are going to be able to commute, is it done in a safe way? The service sector has done this in India. Call centers is famous. They have their minivans, and this is starting a bit in some of the manufacturing sector, but this has to be done at a greater scale if women are to be able to access. But then the housing becomes an important part as well. Residential housing that is done in a way that provides women a safe living environment. Then another key pillar, of course, is then the rights and protection. So the areas that I mentioned before around access to social security and social protection, minimum wages, prevention of sexual harassment, etc. Because if those things are not protected, it's very difficult for women to join, and they'll be very reluctant to leave their household to work. And finally, it's very important to measure and monitor these issues as well. So better measurement of women in the workforce through different types of surveys and a good monitoring and evaluation. So across these dimensions, a coherent, integrated approach is needed. But I would stress that in a country like India, many things are happening at national level. Many important and positive steps are being taken. Increasingly, what needs to happen is at the state level. States will need very clear and focused strategies that look at promoting women in the workplace, addressing these dimensions, linked to the broader schemes of the country around skill development, Make in India, etc.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
That would be all. Thank you for joining us, Sher.
Thank you. My pleasure.